Así que bienvenidos. Vamos a esperar al resto de los invitados en los próximos 2 minutos antes de hacer la presentación formal. Aprovecho para comentarles que estamos haciendo estos encuentros con Americas Capital Investment, o ASI para los amigos, desde el año pasado, tocando distintas temáticas vinculadas al mundo del real estate, no solo local, sino sobre todo internacional. Y en este caso toca la edición Brasil con un experto en la materia que nos va a compartir todo su conocimiento desde Brasil, que es Tobias Bremer. Así que bienvenidos de nuevo. Mi nombre es Facundo Sonati, yo soy periodista de negocios, especializado en empresas de familia. Soy parte también del equipo de ASI y vamos a compartir los próximos 30, 35, 40 minutos repasando junto a Ramiro Juliá, que es el CEO y fundador de ASI, y Carla Albornoz, que es también parte del equipo de Factory de la compañía. El hecho de estos webinars quedan luego subidos a lo que es el canal de YouTube de ASI, y también se comparte a través del newsletter con toda la información de los distintos encuentros que fuimos teniendo desde el año pasado, donde abordamos distintas temáticas vinculadas al real estate, desde lo que tiene que ver, por ejemplo, con opciones de inversiones en materia por ejemplo, industriales, opciones de desarrollos industriales en los Estados Unidos, oficinas, y también hemos estado hablando sobre los distintos mercados en donde tiene presencia ASI, como puede ser Inglaterra, Estados Unidos e incluso la Argentina. Pero hoy toca un capítulo especial que es Brasil, y con esto vamos a darle inicio. Ahí veo que se siguen sumando asistentes, así que si les parecen, para cumplir también con los tiempos y respetar los tiempos de todos los que se sumaron y mostraron interés en este webinar, como les decía, mi nombre es Facundo Sonati, soy periodista de CNN, especializado en empresas de familia, y en este caso los vamos a acompañar junto a Carla Albornoz y Ramiro Juliá del equipo de Americas Capital Investment, así junto a Tobias Bremer, que es nuestro invitado especial desde Brasil. Él es el CEO y fundador de Bauhaus, una compañía, HausBau, perdón, una compañía brasileña con muchísima experiencia en el mercado real estate de Brasil, así que va a ser el protagonista de nuestro webinar el día de hoy. Si les parecen, les dejo la palabra a Ramiro Juliá, que es el CEO de ASI, y recuerden que todos aquellos que tienen preguntas pueden compartirlas a través de este mismo Zoom. Tienen la opción de preguntas y respuestas. Nosotros las vamos a estar justamente reproduciendo a lo largo del webinar o en el final, así que siéntanse libres de hacer todo tipo de consultas con respecto a esta temática en particular, que va a ser justamente la opción de inversión en Brasil. Buenos días a todos. Carla, Ramiro, Tobías, todo suyo.
Gracias, Facu, un placer. Algunos avisos parroquiales. Primero, el idioma, seguramente estemos switchando entre portuñol, spanglish y inglés. Ustedes van a ver que la presentación está en inglés y los datos duros están en inglés, porque es un idioma que manejamos todos, y para que no haya confusiones en las traducciones, el idioma oficial es el inglés, pero vamos a estar switchando entre portuñol y spanglish. Un placer, Facu, tenerte acá. Sos muy humilde, y cuando decís un poquito lo que haces, Facu es un especialista en empresas de familia, un jornalista, como dicen en portugués. Trabaja en CNN y en otros medios, así que es un placer. Es un apasionado por los negocios de familia. Lo pueden seguir por la radio y por distintos medios, así que es un placer que estés acompañándonos con estos programas. Como decía Facu, ya hemos hecho el año pasado webinars con Tony Cho, que hemos tenido, uno de los pioneros en desarrollo en Wynwood, en Miami, uno de los pioneros en la creación de esa ciudad, y otras como Magic City, y otras que está desarrollando Tony. Tuvimos la participación con el equipo de Integras Capital, que son especialistas en familias de alto patrimonio y planificación patrimonial. Bueno, hemos tenido también un par más que están todas, como decía Facu, en nuestro canal de YouTube. Ahí se están terminando, veo muchos amigos que se han sumado, la verdad que muchas gracias. La idea era, nosotros, como ustedes saben, en Americas Capital estamos muy enfocados en mercados de real estate con alta liquidez, por eso estamos hace ya un tiempo invirtiendo mucho en Estados Unidos, en Inglaterra, que nos parecen mercados muy interesantes, muy, muy dinámicos, con mucho volumen, y ahora hemos tomado la decisión, allá hace un tiempo, de ingresar con inversiones en Brasil. Hemos estado dedicados todos el año pasado principalmente a hacer research y evaluaciones y análisis para estar bien claros al momento de entrar. Bueno, Carla, que es nuestra Senior Analyst, nos ha estado acompañando en ese proceso. Y en ese proceso hemos encontrado, bueno, ya con Tobias teníamos una relación de hace más de por ahí 15 años, o por ahí que nos conocemos, y estamos siempre buscando la forma de regionalizar el negocio. Tobias tiene una gran experiencia, y ya me meto en la introducción de Tobias y de lo que vamos a estar hablando hoy. Tiene una gran experiencia hago esta presentación, termino en español y después ya switchamos al inglés, Tobias, pero Tobias tiene una gran experiencia en el mundo de las inversiones, trabajó muchos años en empresas grandes como JP Morgan, cubriendo los mercados en Latinoamérica. Hace 12 años decidió switchar, digamos, dar el salto al mundo de real estate, y un salto difícil del mundo de las inversiones, pasar al mundo terrenal del desarrollo inmobiliario, pero lo ha logrado con muchísimo éxito. Hoy es presidente de HausBau, una empresa que ya tiene 12 años de track record y experiencia. Recuerdo los primeros momentos de Tobias, con muchas ideas, con muchos sueños que los ha llevado a cabo en su mayoría. Tiene todavía mucho para crecer. También nos acompaña Luis, que es mano derecha de Tobias hoy, así que un placer tenerlos. Hoy la empresa se ha convertido en uno de los developers más pujantes del mercado paulista. Ya Tobias nos va a contar, con expertise en desarrollo residencial, de productos orientados principalmente a la clase media. Pero bueno, con un gran nivel de profesionalización en todas las áreas de la compañía, así que es un placer, Tobias. It's a pleasure to have you here. My Portuguese is muito ruim, mas that's why I'm going to continue in English. So it's a pleasure to have you here, and we're all ears to see your vision about Brazil, about the industry, the real estate industry, and the market in general, and probably a little bit of the residential market.
Thank you very much, Ramiro. My Spanish is also not the best, so if we stick to English, that's much easier. Thank you very much for the kind words, for the introduction. Thank you, Carla and Facundo, for setting this up. And thank you for everybody who's on the line to listen to us. With me, as you said, I have Luis Guilherme. He's our Director of Corporate Development. and who is intimately involved in all of our deals and in the development of the company as a whole. As Ramiro said, my background is actually in financial markets. I started my career at JP Morgan, spent some time in London, then went on to work for JP Morgan in New York, and came down to in the Latin American group in New York, came down to Latin America, to Brazil in 2003, and have been here ever since. HausBau, as a company, we started out as a pure play real estate developer focused on the residential market, focused on first-time buyers, on the emerging middle class. We have since branched out, and we are now a full service provider. So we go from sourcing of the deals, sourcing of the lands, approval, sales, the whole credit process, construction, handover of the unit. So today we have a 360-degree solution. Ramiro, what do you think? Should we jump into the presentation and just start talking about the market? Okay,
Perfect.
Carla. Let's put up the presentation. Great. Thank you. Can you go to the next page? We just start with Brazil.
Next, yeah. Well, just exactly. Let's go with that.
Okay. So why Brazil? I think, for anybody looking in Latin America, working in Latin America, it's I think an easy question. Brazil is the largest economy in Latin America, approximately $2 trillion of GDP. It's a economy with a young population. But more importantly, why Brazil now? And Carla, if you want to go to the next page. I think we're at a very interesting moment. Brazil is coming out of the post-COVID moment strong. The Brazilian central bank was very quick to react to the spike of inflation that we saw as a result of the COVID pandemic and the resulting supply chain disruption. So we had 2 years of very high inflation for Brazilian standards. This is now under control. The latest numbers that just came out yesterday show a 12-month trailing inflation below 5%. So that's within the target range of the central bank. Projections see this being stable at around 5%, anywhere between 4 and 6%, which is the target bandwidth of the Brazilian central bank. So inflation's under control. We still have a very high benchmark rate. The Selic central bank benchmark rate is still at 13.75%, but all analysts are indicating that this is about to change. So we're probably getting into an easing of the monetary cycle as of mid-2013. That's obviously very good for the real estate sector. We have record low unemployment at about 8.5%. That's one of the lowest levels in the last 5 years. And I think very important, if you look at Brazil, it's a proven democracy. We just had a change from, let's say, a right-leaning government to a left-leaning government, from Bolsonaro to Lula. Lots of noise, but a very smooth transition at the end of the day. Looking at the new government, we got Lula with left-leaning, but we got the Senate and the lower house, which are more in the center or center-right spectrum of politics. So there's going to be an interesting trade-off between these two camps on getting politics done. Lula for the real estate sector has always been very good. And we'll talk a little bit about what's driving demand in real estate and why I think Lula is good news for the real estate sector.
Perfect. One question, Tobias, could you describe a little bit for those that they don't understand or are not very familiar? I mean, how is the dynamic in general, very quick and very fast, but the dynamic between Sao Paulo and the region, the other areas of Brazil, because it's kind of, you have many countries within one country, right? I mean, when you see the big picture.
Yeah, São Paulo State and São Paulo City are the most important. It's the most important region in Brazil from an economic point of view. São Paulo City is the economic center. Brasilia is the political center. Rio nowadays is really more of a tourism place. It doesn't really have a large industrial base. But São Paulo State and São Paulo City is really where everything happens. The banks are concentrated here. Industry is concentrated here. Large part of the population is concentrated here. São Paulo State represents roughly a third of the Brazilian economy.
Perfect. Yes, and if you want to make questions, please feel free. Tobias is open to have an open discussions in between, so probably we'll be jumping from one slide to the other. So feel free to make questions at any time. I'm talking about the audience.
Yes, and feel free to make the questions also in Spanish. You know, my understanding of Spanish is much better than my ability to speak, but I'm sure between us we managed to respond in Spanglish, Portuñol, or Spanish.
Perfect.
All right, Carla, if you want to jump to the next page, talking a little bit about the Brazilian residential real estate market. It's traditionally a market that is focused on the to-sell segment. Just recently, some other segments have been emerging. So we now see rental opportunities where large institutional players build or buy properties to rent them out and manage them professionally. We now see segments emerging like student housing or senior living housing, but that's something very, very recent. The vast majority of the residential market in Brazil is still straightforward to sell projects. Here at HausBau, we think about the market in three segments. It's the social housing, what we call the affordable housing. So that's kind of middle class, lower middle class, emerging middle class, and the high-end segment or higher middle class and high-end segment. Social housing is obviously the largest chunk, and that addresses people who have income of, let's say, 2 minimum salaries or less than 3 minimum salaries. So we're talking here maybe about $600 monthly income for a family. Here, the government is very active. This is really not something that we do. We are focused on the emerging middle class. We're focused on affordable housing. That's where the largest part of the let's say non-government pie is. And then we also have some projects that are in the middle class. We don't really act in the high end, the high segment, which is very, very concentrated in the city of São Paulo, a couple of other regional capitals, and where you have good opportunities, I would say, but probably more difficult to access. When we talk about the residential housing market in Brazil, we need to talk about the federal housing program called Minha Casa Minha Vida, or until recently Casa Verde Amarelo. It's a very important factor. It's often misunderstood, especially from people looking outside, because essentially there are two programs within one name. One, which we call the Faixa 1, so the first tier of the program, that is really the social housing that I was talking about. That's where the government, or where companies build houses for the government hands out these houses to people in need, and these houses are handed out with the subsidies of up to 90%. This is really a very political program, and that's where a lot of noise sometimes you hear. And if you looked at the last government that we had with Bolsonaro, they basically reduced this significantly. Now Lula is coming back and it's going to increase it significantly, but that's really where a lot of the political noise comes from. On top of that, we have the tier 2, tier 3 segments of this program, which are very well established and are, I would say, apolitical. These have been working well during the previous Lula government. These have been working well during the Dilma government. There was no change when Temer took over. There was no change when Bolsonaro was in the market. So this is really something that's very well established, working very well. And the reason why it's important, it basically, and we're going to talk about it in a slide a little bit further down, it provides access to funding, to mortgages for the vast majority of the population. So it's really important because it provides funding to the people that allow them to buy houses.
Quick question. You mentioned that the benchmark rate, it was 13 point something, 0.25, I think.
75.
Yeah, 75. So how that benchmark or interest rate or cost of the money is interacting with these government programs are still, they're listed at the benchmark price, or they're kind of subsidized?
It's a great question, and it's actually fundamental to understanding the Brazilian real estate market, because when we think about funding for the real estate market, we need to understand where's the money coming from. Where's this money coming from? So we got the benchmark rate at 13.75%. But then we need to look at how is the real estate market funded. And we have several pockets of funding. One is a mandatory workers saving program called FGTS. And basically everybody who's formally employed in Brazil pays into this mandatory worker saving programs. We have it here at the bottom of the page. That program is remunerated at a reference rate, which today is 0.25%. Plus 4%. So this is the people who pay into it, everybody, all of the workers, so all of Brazil gets a low remuneration on that. And by law, the vast majority of the funds in this program need to be applied in the residential real estate market. So this allows the Caixa Econômica Federal, which is the government-owned mortgage bank, to give real estate mortgages to buyers, which range from 6% to 8.7, 8.8% a year. So the middle class has access to long-term funding, 35-year funding, at a rate between 6 to, let's call it 9%, below the benchmark rate. And that's a nominal rate. So if the inflation is 6%, we're talking about a real interest rate of 0 or very close to 0 to 3%. And that's very, very important, because it's driving the accessibility to housing for the people. Then there's a second pocket, which is the savings accounts, which in Brazil we call poupança, and they're remunerated. It's basically where people go and put their savings in any bank. They're remunerated at close to 6%, a little bit above 6%. And again, by law, the banks need to apply a large chunk of that money into the housing financing and into housing funding. So if you don't qualify for the rates of the FGTS, because your income is too high, the next pocket you go to is the savings accounts. And here, currently, the rates are anywhere around 9 to 10%, depending on the bank, depending on your relationship with the bank, depending on your income. So again, you as a purchaser, you have funding for your mortgages at 9 to 10% nominal. So we're talking about, let's say 3 to 4% real interest rates. Yeah. So the benchmark rate is important because it's obviously an indicator for what people are looking for in terms of returns on investment, but it's not directly linked to the mortgage rates that we have in the market, and also not directly linked to the funding cost that we have as a developer when we build these products.
I'm sure all of these, it's making the market very competitive, very attractive now, because basically you're floating below the benchmark rate, right? I mean, that it's a huge incentive.
Yes, I think as a buyer of real estate, being able to get a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage, 35-year mortgage at let's call it 7%, 8%, whatever it is, with an inflation rate of 5-6%, you have a very attractive rate here.
Okay.
Okay, so here when we talk about the Brazilian the residential market, it's really driven by three things. There's a very large housing deficit, so we're lacking enough affordable housing for the people. We have positive demographics and demographic movements, and the third is exactly the availability of an affordable long-term financing. And this is something that changed maybe 15 years ago. There was a change in law, and that actually opened up or created the possibility for these long-term financing. If we look at mortgages as a percentage of GDP in Brazil, we're probably talking about 10%. So the total outstanding mortgages represent more or less 10% of GDP in Brazil. If you compare this to, let's say, very developed nations like the US or Germany or some of the European countries, UK, where we have mortgages as a percentage of GDP above 100%, you see that there's a huge opportunity for the coming decades. Now, everybody says you cannot compare Latin America or Brazil to Europe, and I would agree. But let's just look across to Chile. Mortgages as a percentage of GDP in Chile, if I'm not mistaken, are above 20%. So compared to Chile, you know, if we could just compare Brazil to Chile, you still have a long way to go to catch up with Chile. So this is really very important to understand this availability, and especially when we look at the emerging middle class at first-time buyers. Quite often, what you would pay in rent is equal what you pay for your mortgage. So from a financial perspective, it makes much more sense to buy, because I'm going to be paying the same thing, but I'm going to be owning this property at some point of time. When we talk about the demographics, we still have a growing population, but we also have changes in the household composition. We have smaller households. The multi-generational households are phasing out. People are moving out earlier. Children are moving out earlier, wanting to have their own place. We have more the divorces. That's also a driver. So we got positive demographic trends. We talked about the affordability and the housing deficit. I don't know if I mentioned it. We're somewhere around 6 million units missing in Brazil, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. If we look at the market and try to understand a little bit better these 6 million and also what's the new growth year after year, we took a research report from JP Morgan that estimates a total annual housing demand. So we're talking year after year, new demand of 210 billion reais, divided by 5, roughly $40 billion in new demand every year, 1.1 million new homes. Now, how do we break this down? 2/3 of this is for people with a minimum income of less than 3 minimum salaries. So this is really people who today live in let's say difficult conditions. They might live in the favelas or something like this. So this is a structural problem that we have, and that's really the social housing segment that I talked about before. That's not something we focus on. So this is not a market that we can address. What we are focusing on are the families that earn between 3 and 10 minimum salaries. That's really our target market. We actually go to 12, but in Brazil it's often separated at 10. So we go a little bit more than that, and that represents roughly 1/3 of this number. And then we have 6% that we would consider here the upper segment, so above 10 minimum salaries. So if we just look at what we are looking at as a company, we're looking at an annual demand that is almost 100 billion reais. That's in all of Brazil. Now, if we break this down to São Paulo, Carla, if you switch to the next page, please. How does that look for the state of São Paulo? Because Brazil, when we talk about Brazil, Brazil is a continent. It's the size of Europe. The dynamics in the different markets are very different. So we focus exclusively on the São Paulo market. How does São Paulo stack up compared to Brazil? We have 47 million people in the state of São Paulo. So it compares to quite a few countries in Europe, I would say. We got 22 million people in the metropolitan area of São Paulo. It's the wealthiest state. It represents roughly a third of the Brazilian GDP, roughly 20-something% of the people. If we compare this to the world, it would be anywhere in the top 25 economies. I just had a look actually before we came on. It's maybe 150-160% of the Argentine GDP, just the São Paulo state. So it's a very large market to focus on. We have an existing deficit here of 1.2 million units in the state of São Paulo, half of which are in the city or in the metropolitan area of São Paulo. So that's São Paulo proper, plus the surrounding small cities that we have here. The annual demand, again, according to JP Morgan, is 53 billion reais, half of which falls into our target markets. So we have an annual demand that we can address as a company of roughly 27 billion reais, or what's that, $5.5 billion. That translates to more or less 100,000 new units per year. Just talking about the deficit, I think that's something that's important because people throw out these numbers. But it's important to keep in mind that it's there, but probably 2/3 of it is really not our target market. Okay.
It's huge. So I see that you said that in the previous slide, you said that 2/3 of the demand is more social or government oriented, or I would say the lower spectrum of
That is in all of Brazil, and there is a distortion if you compare the northeast of Brazil, which is traditionally poorer than São Paulo. So in São Paulo, 52% actually falls in our target market. So it's 30% if you look at all of Brazil, but if we look at São Paulo, 52%.
52. So that also speaks about the wealth that has been built in São Paulo as a region, right?
Exactly. That's a direct consequence of the strength of the market here.
Perfect. Do you have anything else? No.
Yeah, we have just one last slide for the city of São Paulo. So we talked about Brazil. We now talked about the state, and we are active in the city of São Paulo and the state of São Paulo. But talking specifically of the city of São Paulo, which is in itself a huge market with 22 million inhabitants. We had a number of changes over the last couple of years, which actually made real estate development focusing on the entry-level, first-time buyers, emerging middle class, much more feasible here. We had a number of changes in the zoning laws. We specifically have two programs here. One is called HIS, the other one is called HMP. Doesn't matter what that stands for, but it's basically laws that incentivize the building of affordable projects within the city, and not on the periphery, but within the city center. So as a developer, you get more building potential without having to pay for it, and that allows you to buy the land, and it allows you to develop these sorts of projects in the city of São Paulo. So this has been really a key driver for the city of São Paulo. You can see it in the slide or in the graph that we have down there from 2016, the darker part of the bars. That's really the affordable housing part. And you see how this has increased, going from very little to roughly 50% over the last 6-7 years. So that has been very, very important. In the city of São Paulo, we've seen over the last couple of years an increase in launches. It shows for the demand for housing. So we're now launching about 70,000 units per year, half of which in the affordable segment. And we have an existing inventory in all of São Paulo, somewhere around the same. So a project normally sells out during construction. So over 2-year period, you normally sell down. Oh, actually, you do sell down 100% of the units that you've launched, and that's actually part of our business model. We are normally 100% sold by the time we hand over the project.
Perfect. I have 2 questions about that, and I'm also starting to receive questions from the audience. But 2 questions. One, how many projects have you done in the Sao Paulo area in general since you started?
That's a good question. We have currently about 1,000 units on sale in the market in 5 different projects.
Mm-hmm.
We're in our 3rd, what I call, cycle of projects, and we have a pipeline of roughly 2,500 units yet to launch. In the city of São Paulo, we currently have 3 projects ongoing.
And for to understand the business model, the cycle, how usually, from the investor point of view, how usually the project works? I mean, how is the duration? Can you describe a little bit in general, what are the different stages of a project? Because you
Sure.
said that you pre-launch and you sell during the construction time.
Sure. We look at it as 6 stages at the end of the day. It's the project sourcing and buying of the land, due diligence, approval, pre-launch, then the funding with the bank, construction, and handover. That's more or less how we look at it.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the whole cycle of this, we have, due diligence normally 3 months, somewhere around there. Approval in the city of São Paulo is probably a year. Pre-launch, 6 to 9 months. There's some overlap here. Construction 2 years, and then handover. That's within a month or something. So if we look at the overall cycle, we're probably talking about 4.5-5 years from finding the opportunity, doing the due diligence, to handing over the project.
Perfect. And what are the...
Camilo,
Sí.
invito, si les parece, también a todos los que están participando, son casi 40 personas, a compartir sus preguntas. Tienen la opción de hacerlo tanto abajo a través del chat como en la opción de preguntas y respuestas. Y tengo una pregunta para Tobias, que viene a colación, digamos, de esto que estamos mencionando, quizás. ¿Cuáles son, digamos, los precios actuales o los valores actuales de las inversiones justamente vinculadas a opciones residenciales en San Pablo en términos históricos? ¿En qué valores está hoy el área de San Pablo y específicamente en el segmento donde invierte HausBau?
Mm-hmm. If I understood you correctly, Facundo, the average price per square meter in the city of São Paulo is now somewhere around 9,500 reais per square meter. That's close to $2,000 per square meter, 1,900. we have traditionally seen this gone up. We do see in Brazil cycles in the prices also, especially if you take out inflation. So there's normally a ramp up, then we have a little bit of a more stable period, then it ramps up again, etc. The interesting in Brazil or in São Paulo, given that it's such a huge market, you have probably projects that are launching at 5,000 reais a square meter, and you definitely have projects that are 40,000 reais a square meter. So depending where you are in the city, you will pay very, very different prices. We are working in segments in São Paulo that are between I would say 7,000 to 13,000 reais per square meter. And what's really driving this is location. At the end of the day, it's location, proximity to the metro, to the public transportation, and then obviously what's the type of the product. But it's really driven by location.
Clarísimo. Ramiro, ¿ibas a hacer una pregunta?
No, la pregunta es ¿cuál es la expectativa de rentabilidad? No hablo a nivel inversor, sino a nivel proyecto que tiene el ciclo que había descrito Tobias de inversión desde el principio al final, ¿no? What is the project IRR or expected IRR if the thing goes average with the project, with a development?
I think development that in the city of São Paulo that is well run, that doesn't have any unforeseen problems or something like this, we're probably looking for 25% IRR, somewhere around there.
Okay. No. That's project level. Then the investor
project level, and then depending on the structure, you might have some cost there.
You have to subtract a little bit. So we're talking between 20 to 25% IRR on a moderate project, I would say.
Yes, I would say on a conservative basis.
With a holding period of an average 4 years, 4.5.
Yes. Okay. Yes. I think, yes.
Mm-hmm. So mainly the investment is done at the beginning, because then you have the bank that comes into the picture, right?
Yes, we have a couple of a couple of key points along the way. So obviously, right at the beginning, at the purchase of the land, it depends a little bit how the land is purchased. If there's a component that is a land swap, which is actually quite common, that at least part of the land is bought or is paid for either through a percentage of revenue of the project or by giving finished units to the landowner. Mm-hmm. But you definitely have the purchase of the land as a first cash event. And then the second big cash event is when you launch, when you go to the market. So basically you buy the land, you do the due diligence, buy the land, go into approval. Here the costs are legal, projects, and any purchase price of the land that you have. Then over the year, there's relatively little expenses as the government, as the city authorities analyze the project. And then you have a second event, which is when you launch. So in Brazil, we normally sell the units, or we start selling prior to construction. So we will build a show apartment, a sales stand, and we will start offering these units to purchasers. And that's obviously, you need to build a show apartment, you need to do your marketing campaign, you want to be online, you want to be offline, you want to make sure that you talk to all of the right people. So there's an expense which is relevant for about 6 months, which is your pre-launch or your pre-construction period. Once you get the minimum amount of purchasers ready, you then you then start construction. And there are two funding types here. You either take these people to the bank and already get their funding. That's called the associate funding system. That is more on the lower, lower income or entry level side. Or once you have the minimum amount of purchasers, you go to the bank, and the bank will say, "Okay, I'll fund you the construction of this project, but you have to put in 20% of the cost." So that's really when you have the third, let's say, capital demand. So it's purchasing, launch, and start of construction.
Perfecto.
Ya estamos en tiempo, así que si les parece, agradecemos obviamente primero que nada a Tobias por toda la información, la verdad que súper claro, muy completo, y también obviamente a todos los que participaron y se hicieron un espacio en su mañana para justamente compartir con nosotros este encuentro. Así que, de nuevo, de mi parte, muchísimas gracias a Tobias y también a todo el equipo, Ramiro, Carla y todo detrás de escena de ASI que justamente hizo posible este webinar.
Muchísimas gracias, Facundo. Gracias a todos. Gracias, Tobias. Y bueno, seguimos la conversación. Como decíamos, esto es un beginning. Y vamos a seguir hablando de estos temas seguramente.
And also from my side, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Facundo, Ramiro, Carla. Thank you for putting this together, and thank you for everybody who was online here.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.